Welcome to the Korean podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Merose Hwang. And this is a follow-up to the previous podcast, in which I also interviewed Merose, and which we discussed in detail the history of shamanism throughout the colonial period. And I also need to correct a mistake from that podcast, where I referred to Merose as an assistant professor at Hiram University. It should have been associate professor at Hiram College, where she is in fact the associate professor of history and the program coordinator for Asia Studies minor. And today's podcast, as much as it builds on the previous one, is an academic exercise unto itself, where we're going to discuss an upcoming chapter that Merose has in the book Queer Korea, due to come out next month from Duke University Press. This chapter is titled Ritual Specialists in Colonial Drag, Shamanic Interventions in 1920s Korea. And this is once again a fascinating look at the colonial period and the place that shamans find themselves within it. But of course, through a much different lens. Here, the focus is going to be on the question of colonial spiritual assimilation, the effort by the Japanese to bring shamans into the fold, to regulate them, and in some ways to mainstream them so that they could control them. And yet at the same time, the shaman's ability to stand outside this, with the running theme on both sides of this challenge, that of gender, transgenderism, and the risk that the shamans presented to the colonial regime. A lot of this happens after the March 1st movement, of course, in 1919, when there is a manufactured effort to both document the shamans from the Japanese side through a series of studies, institutions, and scholarship, and a pushback from the Korean media itself and the religions inside Korea, who considered the ties that seemed to be growing between the shamans and the Japanese community and government as a large as a risk to Korean identity, an assimilation that was happening, a stealing away of Korean history and identity, and a pushing of Korean back into pre-modern times. And a lot of the impetus for this discussion channels its way through the creation of certain guilds and societies, where the shamans in some way became mainstream, put on plays and public rituals, stepped outside what used to be the traditional bounds of private houses. And as popular as these plays and rituals were, they were also subversively challenging the idea, not just of colonial rule, but also of traditional gender roles, something which scholars were trying manfully to paint in the opposite direction, to reimagine the shamans in a masculine light, as well as Korean history in this same light. There is so much in this podcast and so much in this research and interview. It runs like a narrative at times. And as we build it up, as Merose begins to open up her research, it really does come to life. And the image of shamans inside colonized Korea and the important role that they had in defining both what was modern and what constituted the Korean identity is unmistakable. But from here, I'm going to let Merose open up the research for you. And at any point throughout this podcast, if we touch on topics that seem a little bit too fleeting, please go back and listen to the previous podcast, for which those gaps should be filled in with a much broader view of shamans in the colonial period. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. All the help in this regard is greatly appreciated. On that, and to talk us through the intersections between gender, transgenderism, Korean identity, and shamanism in the colonial period, this is Merose Hwang. Merose Hwang, thanks for coming back on the Korean podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So we did a podcast recently on your work on colonialism and shamans and a lot of the phenomena there. And there may be a little bit of overlap in this podcast. So I will encourage listeners to go back and listen to that one first if they'd like, though of course this one will stand alone. And this one will stand alone because it touches on an article or a chapter of yours that is recently come out, and it's absolutely fascinating. It really digs into some deep history here. So before we build the story up, I might get you to introduce it, this idea of ritual specialists in colonial drag and shamanist interventions, which is a topic which people may think, I'm not really sure where this is coming from. So I might get you to start by opening this up for us, and then we will jump into the broader story and the broader research.
Okay. Well, so it's the first chapter of a book that's coming out. It's a kind of an edited volume called Queer Korea that they due out in January 2020 out of Duke University Press. And this, so the listeners know a way to access this book. The book is coming out of a Perverse Modernity series that was created by Lisa Lowe and Jack Halberstam. These are two scholars that have been really formative in queer and sexuality studies. And the book is the first book of its kind to really explore that idea of history and the social circumstances around queerness in Korea. They asked me to come in to talk about the first part of the book, which is on the history of queer movements in Korea. And so my first chapter is called Ritual Specialist in Colonial Drag, where I'm really looking at the kind of understudied topic about homosexuality and non-normative sexuality within shamanism in the history of Korea. And so that was the purpose of this project.
So let's jump into the details, and as we walk through this is going to build up in a really fascinating way, so I can't wait for this. Let's go to this idea of cultural, of colonial spiritual assimilation.
Uh-huh.
And I suppose this takes us back, of course, to the colonial period and the idea of folk customs, but there's this broader idea at the time of regulations being placed on the spirituality inside the country by the Japanese. So that is probably a very important first step to take for this idea that suddenly the religions and the spirituality inside Korea was suddenly being assimilated and brought into, by force often, into the Japanese colonial state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that probably the Koreanists in your listenership probably know a bit about the idea that Shinto was a state religion that was enforced by the Japanese Empire throughout its colonies, and that shamanism, for those who might know, shamanism then was used as a way to justify the practice of Shinto and the institutionalization of Shinto in Korea because it was seen as a primitive form of Shinto. And so there are people like Sogang is the one I'm thinking of in particular, who really forwarded this idea that shamanism was used as a colonial device to really push for Shinto and cultural and religious assimilation during the colonial period. And certainly there was an aspect of that. But one of the arguments that I make is that Shinto existed in Korea at least for closer to 100 years prior to the Japanese colonial era. And there's some records of this. I think Taegon Kim, who is no longer with us, from Sogang University, was a Jesuit priest, did a bit of research on this to show that there were Shinto shrines and churches and religious memberships in Korea for quite a while before this time period. And so how did then the colonial government deal with the expatriate Shinto practitioners and the indigenizing of Shinto practice, while at the same time working with shamanism, which was really a very different kind of thing than Shinto. So that part that, that I guess a lot of the Shintoists were arguing that Shintoism and shamanism were similar, in some ways was kind of a farce, but that Shinto did not exist prior to the 1930s Shinto policies, I think, is also not quite that accurate.
And of course, it's important to open up here something that's really fundamental and does come through at different parts in your research here. The idea that while the Japanese were trying to incorporate shamanism and get a handle on it, the Korean printing presses were pushing back with extreme force at the time, complaining that in some ways the government were having a soft hand with shamans. In some way, this was going to become a risk to society. And there's all these wonderful quotes from these old newspapers with titles such as "To Get Rid of the Shamans," and complaining about the irresponsibility of this interventionist program in some way that this might legitimize the shamans into the future.
Yeah, that argument about the kind of anti-shamanism discourse is something that I've written a lot about, including in the previous podcast where we discussed that. So that idea that that the newspapers then were not just providing reportage on shamanic behavior, but that they were actually trying to act as social engineers to motivate their readers and the community in general, the Korean community in general, to stop patronizing shamanism, was really a part of their task, perhaps more a part of their task than actually providing reportage.
So what were they hoping to do? What were these complaints about? What were they hoping would be the Japanese approach to the shamans? Was it a return to strict, penal penalties or strict regulations? So this, I suppose, a lot of this can happen after the March 1919 movement, and of course, it might feel that the Japanese were easing off a little bit. So what were the Koreans and the Korean newspapers in particular, what were they so upset about? Were they simply hoping for a much stricter, much more regulated society?
Yeah, I think that was part of it. And so what an interesting thing to note here is that the Koreans they weren't so interested in just eliminating shamanism, but really what they were afraid of was that shamanism then was going to be used by the colonial government to further regulate and assimilate Koreans to becoming like Japanese. And so the deep fear that you see in a lot of these writings that goes kind of unsaid because of the censorship laws is that if shamanism exists, then there's a greater possibility that Koreans could become assimilated to Japaneseness, could become really invested in things like Shinto, could lose their sights on the national movement, the need to regain national sovereignty. And I think that was at the heart of it, and it was the main reason that they were wanting to get rid of shamans. I mean, on top of it, sure, I think that a lot of people were saying that this was backwards and it was making Korea lag behind. But these ideas that they were what I call conspicuous indigents, this is a term that I use to kind of try to understand why this subaltern community was kind of silent in the mass media and then misrepresented in the modern ethnographies, but that they were conspicuous was a problem for the indigenous writers, that they were so unmodern, they were so unprogressive and non-nationalistic in the minds of these cultural nationalists. That was the biggest problem, I think. And it was a very urgent problem for a lot of these writers. And so some of the strategies that the writers used was to kind of shame them or to kind of impose this fear onto people that patronize shamans in order to get rid of them. And then to talk generally in almost like hyperbolic ways about how Korea was going to fall into the abyss if the shamans would be allowed to reign over society. And so those are some of the kinds of rhetoric or the tropes that were being used in the colonial period.
So let's introduce a step here, which is something the Japanese try a lot. And it comes, at least first through your research, through a particular character, Maruyama Chi Jun. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Mm-hmm. And this is a scholar that is brought in under the colonial administration to study. I suppose you right here, in a way, he is a trained sociology, but he has a sociologist, but he has a particular emphasis on criminology. And this becomes quite fascinating because trying to assess the Korean character and the Korean thought, he starts studying these previous criminal records of dissidents, and that brings him, of course, to the door of the shamans.
Yeah. Maruyama Chi Jun was not the first person to actually study shamanism in Korea. There was, as early as 1905, we had the Taiwanese colonial administration that was working to understand Taiwanese shamanism, and then those people, it was a police chief in Taiwan, a Japanese colonial police chief who was in charge who became kind of like a shaman expert in Taiwan. He and his staff then, as soon as the protectorate period began in Korea, they were transported to the Korean peninsula to begin work there. And so he had been working there from 1905 onwards and all the way into the cultural rule period. But as a part of the new cultural rule administration, Maruyama Chi Jun was the first person that was designated specifically for that task. I am not sure exactly about the relationship between Maruyama and the earlier scholars from Taiwan, but I'm sure that there was quite a bit of overlap. It seems that Maruyama kind of was doing this research as if he was like a one-man show, but I'm sure he borrowed greatly from the earlier works and publications that had existed already on the Korean Peninsula about shamanism.
So let's touch on the institute that was set up at the same time here. This is the Sociology and Anthropology Department in Seoul, at Seoul Imperial University. And this is an interesting thought, and I suppose a tactic that may be used in other countries around the world, which at least has been used by colonial governments. And that is the idea that they set out to deliberately and train ethnographers to research indigenous Korean activities. And the idea was, and you quote here, to pluck the sprouts of Korean insurgency. So that is an interesting idea, the idea of setting up a university school and a university program to then bring through a regular stream of people out there who would study indigenous Korean culture in the hope that it would cut down at the knees any future insurgency.
Yeah. So that Seoul National University, which was Korean University at the time, they really were invested in this, training ethnographers on this. And it was an interesting new movement because the ethnography movement in Korea, well, it was started by what I believe was Edward Burnett Tyler was the main social anthropologist out of England that they tried to emulate. And what was really revolutionary about the study once Kejo University became the main flagship for this program was that up until this point, people who were researching things on shamanism in Korea were not doing them by participating in field observation. So they were not actually going into the field to do this. They were rather writing about this in a more theoretical way and based on hearsay or based on kind of firsthand accounts of things that might have happened in their paths in life. But it wasn't something that researchers would go out, would be trained on how to kind of observe, participate, take notes, and to kind of analyze the data of what they had, first-hand observations. Those types of practices were something very new to the Keijo program. And Maruyama was one of the first people to actually participate in that kind of campaign.
And it is important to note here, as the Japanese will bring in Korean shamanism into the fold, into their own field here, this is an interesting idea that you write here. And you write, shamanistic ritual specialists were represented under the government branch, and they were represented, as you said there, as an indigenous theism. And you're right, this made them a silent but important contender in the religious debate, which brings in, of course, the question of the other religions out there in the debate, which you also write in the very next sentence. The other religions were desperate to show themselves as unshamanistic, to stand apart from them and to delineate themselves. So this is an odd dichotomy of the colonial state desperate to bring shamanism under the same branch of all other religions and in a way then muffle them and silence them into the crowd, and the crowd trying to step away from the shamans at the same time and to say they're very different from us.
Right. Yeah, it is interesting because I mean the whole idea of what was or what was not religion was a really big debate issue, and these people that were, and part of the issue was we've got the Christian churches and their magazines and publications in Korea, and those Christian churches are largely funded by the older institutions outside of Korea, whether that be in Britain or in Rome or what have you. And so the Christian organizations into most of the 1920s had this kind of buffer from the colonial government. They could they could be more flexible in the things that they said and have protection against some of the censorship because they were governed by these external organs. And they were partially the ones responsible for saying these are real religions. These other things that happen in Korea, they're kind of superstitions, but they're not real religions. And the Japanese government then is trying to bring all of these things together and manage those things. But another big issue was that the Japanese, prior to the Shinto movement, were trying to instate a Japanese Buddhism in Korea. Japanese Buddhism, the branch of Japanese Buddhism, the Wonbur-gyo, that was a very big issue, and there was a hotly debated issue around how to regulate the Buddhist order that was actually stemming out of Japan, and then the new Buddhist sects that were emerging. And so that was probably more of a concern for the Japanese colonial government because of the way they refined what they said was going to be real religions or not. But the Japanese government also then instated these things, and this was not just in Korea, but all throughout the Japanese Empire. They instated these different types of tiers in their religious policies. So the first tier was then that there were these religions that they would actually call religion. And then there was a lower tier that was considered to be folklore and folk-based practices and spiritualities. And then below that were things like culture and customs-based practices. And the tiers then determined a lot of the different ways you could actually call yourself an institution, whether you're calling yourself a church or you're calling yourself, as I examine here, as a labor board, a cultural labor board, where this particular shaman group falls under. Those things were administered then by the colonial government based on the tier system of religions. And so you really wanted to make sure that you were fitting within one of those tiers in order to get certain kinds of flexibility and ability to kind of practice and run your organization in Korea. But the problem here was that shamanism up to this time hadn't really been centralized, although there were attempts made in the Joseon period, particularly around the Sungshin and Joap, the Spirit Worshippers Guild. There were attempts that were made in the late 1800s with that guild, but there wasn't any major efforts to kind of centralize the shaman organizations. And a lot of shamanists today would argue that there was no such thing as an organization because shamans are the antithesis of organized religion. But in fact, we saw this branch in the 1920s of a kind of organization that was trying to work within the policy structure of the colonial government. And in that, they were recognized as a labor and culture organization. And so they fit under the customs category. Sometimes they fit under the folklore and folk customs category, while they never fit into the actual religion category. And what the other church organizations, I'll call them church organizations, whether they be Buddhist or Shinto or what have you, those organizations were feeling quite threatened by these previously unorganized spiritual movements. And so the thing that you see so pervasively occurring within the literature, the religion journals and magazine literature, is how their religion is a true religion. And other practices are superstitious, they are unscientific, they're unmodern practices. And so that becomes a very pervasive part of it. And so what they're really actually saying is that we are really the opposite of those shamans. We're the opposite of those Taoists, those other people that are out there that we don't believe should be recognized as religious organizations. And also fit into that, to complicate the matter even further, is that the part and parcel to this was a kind of health campaign where religious organizations were trying to also argue the efficaciousness of their organization, while the modernization medical practices were being instated in Korea. And so where the traditional medicines fell, and those being what we call Korean medicines or Eastern medicines or Chinese medicines, those words are kind of used interchangeably. prior to the 1920s, from the Chosun period onwards, they had their own categories, and there was a licensing system around that. But now at this time, we see that the colonial government is still quite interested in incorporating some of the Eastern medicine practices and the licensure system, but the indigenous church publications seem to be quite opposed to that. And they're arguing that they are, the shamans are kind of in cahoots with these traditional medical practitioners, and that they should both be thrown out, baby in the bathwater, they should all be thrown out. And so that's also happening at this time.
So on that same topic, and we didn't get to touch on this much in our first podcast, so a slight side here, but it is in your research, the question of the Tonghak movement. Now, this is Eastern Learning Church, as it's translated. And as you write here, it's this mix between anti-imperialism, nationalistic, millenarian, and it's also got shamanistic elements. So what is the place for the Tonghak movement in all of this? How did it sit within this complex field?
Yeah, the Tonghak movement, there's a whole slew of research done on the Tonghak movement, particularly in Korea, less so perhaps in English publications, but it does deserve its own kind of subcategory in Korean studies because it is quite big and established in Korea. The Eastern Learning Movement, so they are mostly known today as a Cheondogyo. And in fact, there's right by Insadong, there's the center of the Cheondogyo Church in Seoul today. And so they're still an active church that existed from the 1860s onward. I should say it's from the 1830s, and in the 1860s it really picked up steam. The Cheondogyo, the Heavenly Way, if you want to call that the Heavenly Way Church, interestingly, it emerged as an anti-imperial organization. So the first time it really surfaces in the 1860s, it surfaces as a peasant rebellion movement. I mean, it certainly has spiritual elements to it and millenarian aspects to it, as you had mentioned. But the call for saving the nation, this kind of spiritual calling to save Korea, were based on the idea that peasants were going to lead the country into the future, and they took up arms in order to forward this their vision for the nation. But the time when most people probably remember the Tonghak movement is perhaps around the what they call the Tonghak uprising of 1895 or 1894. That then spurred the 1895 Sino-Japanese War that really was won by the Japanese, not necessarily that it was lost by the Chinese, but more so it was lost by the Koreans. Because it's the first proxy war that most Koreans remember. And in that fight, then the Tonghak are considered to be again, I'm going to use that word, shit disturbers. They are seen as the people that ended up causing the Japanese to enter into the Korean business. And they, really prompted the Japanese to consider colonizing Korea. Of course, these are all thoughts that are comments that are being made in hindsight. Who knows really if at the time people actually believed that? I don't think they could have forecasted that in 1895, what would happen in 1910. But nonetheless, Tonghak movement is seen as a peasant movement that, the seeds of insurgency, the sprouts of insurgency, that is there. That was certainly the colonial government was keeping a close eye on that because of their history of uprisings. And so that magazine from the Heavenly Way Church and other magazines that came up after that were really heavily regulated. And that journal was had one of the loudest voices about what was or what was not religion, what was or what was not superstition, and how their religion had nothing to do with shamanism, although there are very much shamanic elements within the Tonghak movement. And so that idea that they were, a real church was something that they were constantly saying. Not just the Cheondogyo Seolbo, the monthly magazine, but other magazines that came up after, like Kaebyok and Daemyeong. Those magazines then really also were pushing this idea that they were very much a modern religious organization. They're very much into progressivism, into the democratization of indigenous capital, etc., and all of this stuff. And so they were trying to show how they were really one and the same with colonial agendas in their magazines, and also to say that they were very anti-shamanic.
So from there, let's take a deep dive into the Sanctioning Cooperative, which is this fascinating part of your research here. And it comes from the government general and as we mentioned there, the oversight to bring churches together. And they established a new church, the Singhan Church, which brings together 60 different factions under this. Yeah. And of course, as we touched on it briefly already, but the popularity of it within the Japanese community is something that is quite fascinating here. They openly participate in Shinto festivals, as you say there. But of course, an interesting part of this is, you write, it was a non-religious act. It was actually a civic engagement with the colonial state, not a religious engagement with a Shinto shrine per se. So let's open up that cooperative, because that's a fundamental part here. And the idea that how well they seem to interact with the broader Japanese community in Seoul.
So that idea that the participating in Shinto ceremonies and rituals and festivals was civic and not religious was a line that was being used by the colonial government. So the government general would say that going to register at the Shinto shrine or worship at the Shinto shrine was not something that we were pushing onto Koreans as a infringement of their religious rights. But it was rather for them to show and demonstrate that they were good citizens or subjects of the Japanese Empire. So this was more socio-political expression and less a religious expression. And so that was something that was constantly being pushed by the colonial government. And the Shinhan Church, that was a church of the Sungshinin Joap, the spirit worshippers, they latched onto this idea that they were part and parcel to this kind of civic expression of abiding to the Japanese colonial mission. And that was the worst thing in the minds of the indigenous intellectuals. They saw that the shamans had completely sold themselves out. And this was perhaps more dangerous than any other initiative that had come to fore of the Japanese assimilationist policies.
And yet, at the same time, there's something that is fundamental to shamanism, the ability to incorporate other religions in this way. So before we get in, I feel like we're building in and narrowing in on your thesis here. As you're right, during the Chosun dynasty, it wouldn't have been surprising, you're right here, to see them incorporate Shinto symbols into their rituals, simply as a way to bridge the gap between the Chosun and the Meiji world. But you're also right, of course, they've incorporated Mahayana Buddhism, and there's Taoism incorporated there. So shamanism is this religion that has that tendency. It is expected in some ways that they would incorporate these things, because they have this history and this tendency to incorporate other faiths and other rituals into their own worldview and their own, I suppose, ritualistic behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely right. And I think that, going back to your previous question or comment about the Japanese finding this popular, they did. They found the performances and the different types of ceremonies and celebrations that the Sungshinin Joap had conducted to be incredibly interesting, entertaining, and inclusive. So they saw themselves, if you were a Japanese expatriate living in Seoul and you saw this, you would see an element of familiarity and some play and maybe some avant-garde things that you might appreciate by participating in these festivals. And so it was really wildly popular for the colonial people of the colonial administration, but also the Japanese expatriate population and to local Koreans. And, you know, again, that's speaking to this thing that a lot of us really know about shamanism is that shamanism is inherently what we call a syncretic religion or a syncretic spiritual practice. And what I mean by that, if people don't know the word syncretism, is that you take these, you know, there are these two foreign concepts, and when the foreign concepts come together, when they meet each other, then they form this kind of other thing that becomes an amalgamation of those two different concepts. And shamanism is that, in that it is able to then borrow from, use, and maybe even relegate foreign concepts into its pantheon and its cosmology in ways that are much more flexible than these other organizations that are very much church-based or kind of a tenet, kind of these clerically based. And so it did that again with the Mahayana Buddhism. It did that with Taoism. It has done that with Confucianism for sure. It's done that with many other types of religious organizations that have come into Korea, that have made contact with Korea, and even going so far as to even incorporating in the post-war period a lot of the kind of popular American icons like Elvis Presley and Douglas MacArthur. And so we hear stories about shamanic rituals that incorporate the spirits of these foreigners. And so that is not something that should be foreign. The idea that they bring in these kind of foreign elements is not something that is unfamiliar to shamanic practice in Korea. It's part of what shamanic practice is, which might raise some questions about whether or not then what is indigenous about shamanism. But that I can question that another time.
Sure. Let's move on to, I suppose, the commission of two men under the Japanese government, Cho Nam-sun and Yi Nan-hwa. And they are brought together with this massive project under this idea to create, in some ways, a broad history of the Korean Peninsula and the Korean people. And you write here that this is hugely important because it's an attempt to understand Korean history in its entirety through the lens of shamanism. And this is going to walk us into the thrust of your chapter here. So let's open up that moment and exactly what were these men tasked with doing? What were they trying to achieve?
Yeah. So in that chapter, when I asked the question, like, what is the purpose of using shamanism to understand Korean history, and whose interest does that serve? So I started to explore those questions by saying it benefited colonialists by again rendering Korean backwards as being unable for self-government and needing Japanese to rule over them. But I also posit this idea that it produced this underexplored effect. Where the writers like Chen Nam-sun, Yi Nan-hwa, and then the readers and the other scholars that were kind of circulating around the kind of the orbit of the cultural nationalists, that for them, it allowed them to actually feel for a nation that the Japanese Empire was erasing. So while they could not say, we mourn for our lost country, because that would be a dangerous thing to say at this time, they could actually mourn for the lost nation through these more creative ways. And so shamanism then becomes an outlet for that expression, kind of this unprecedented way of mourning for a nation and grieving for it so deeply that it could perhaps resuscitate the nation, plant these seeds within Koreans to really try to resuscitate the nation that has been taken away. And so it was a call to action in a way, through this kind of very effective expression.
And that is important, of course, because Cho Nam-sun was imprisoned for his writing around the March 1st movement in 1919, of course. But one of the things that begins to come through here, and we're going to build this up, is the idea of the nation's ethno-spiritual father. And this is Cho, who begins to look for Korea's historical roots. And he pushes, of course, away from the idea that it's come in any way or some way connected to the Japanese archipelago, and begins to push into the Asian continental interior. So what is that shift? What is Cho trying to do here?
Yeah, so Chen Nam-son is actually, he's playing very liberally with a lot of these ethnographers that existed from Russia onward in the Russian Far Eastern frontier, with some of the research that they had done on Russian Siberian ethnographies. And he looks at a kind of connection to the hinterland, the inner Asian hinterland, Siberia and Korea. So that connection he finds, I believe, is a kind of queer continentalism, is what I call it. And when he's pointing towards Siberia, so it's, northwest of Korea, he's pointing in the opposite direction of the Japanese archipelago, which is southeast of Korea. And he's saying, while the Japanese are saying that Koreans and Japanese were one time distant cousins, that they actually came from the same place, he spins that logic in the opposite direction by saying that Koreans come from like inner Asia. And part of his argument, his thesis, is that we can see this connection because of the shared transgendered shamanic practices that have occurred both in the Siberian hinterland and in Korea. So that's why I call it queer continentalism. And that's what he's actually trying to do is show this connection to Asia that is very different from what Japan has, to say Koreans and Japanese have nothing in common.
And there's also a state. Of course, we're going to dig into that queer and that transgender aspect here in a second here. But there's also, it seems to be a deliberate attempt to make the Korean heritage more masculine in a way. It talks about a male-dominated tradition, and it begins to change the face of Korean shamans, and through its as you mentioned there, through its connection back to this continental history. It talks of priests and medicine men and prophets, and the idea that these were despite Korean shamanism today, I suppose we haven't mentioned that too much. We did in the last podcast. It's a female-dominated field today, at least in terms of the practitioners. But he is making an attempt here to twist it back and say it actually has a male-dominated history.
He's playing off of a newly emerging field of Shilla studies. So the Shilla dynasty is this pre-modern dynasty that existed in the first millennia of the Common Era in the South and central Korean peninsula. And when they find these Shilla relics, basically from these tombs, these kind of royal tombs, the archaeologists find this, they are really stunned by this. And so a Shilla kind of, Shilla study renaissance emerges in the 1920s. And so he's piggybacking on this to say that then Korean shamanic religion, the kind of the primordial religion of Korea, was originally very patriarchal and patrilineally based. The first shaman was male, and the first shamanic practitioners, the practitioner population, then were these male members of society. They were priests, like you're saying, they're medicine men, they were prophets, they were doctors, they were teachers. All these words that were used in a very masculine way. Those were the words that were used for Korean shamans when they originated in Korea. And these are the same words that we find in the Buryati shamanism of North Central Asia. And so there's this Korean Buryati Siberian connection that he's drawing out from this idea of these kind of nomenclatures of shamanism.
So let's get into that question of this transgender question, which is fundamental here. And the idea, of course, as Chase speaks about here, he speaks about these men, these shamans, and he talks about them fallen into a spiritual illness of sorts. This is how he begins to explain the phenomena here. And he said there's no other cure for them other than to cross-dress and to change their gender. But of course, this illness is ordered by the spirits in a way. This is a shamanic, this is from the spirits ordering a shaman to, in a sense, become transgender. And of course, before as a second question on this, it seems as though this is a unidirectional thing. There aren't women being ordered to become men. It's always men being ordered to become women here.
Right. Very good point there. Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's something that Yi Neung-hwa, who writes the later chapters of their treatise, he talks about a bit more, but Che is focusing only on that unidirectional male to female transition. And what Che is talking about is this transition from paleo practice to neo religious practice. And so he calls it, from Ku to Shin religious practices. And in that transition, then you see this, there's social pressure for men to then start feminizing themselves. And he says this, that it's done by the order of the spirits, that they enter into these homosexual marriages with male spirits, and that the spirits would be unhappy if they had conjugal relationships with women, and so they have no option but then to become women themselves, to create a heterosexual spiritual union and to continue practicing as shamans. And he's not really clear about how they go about changing their sex, but he is clear in saying that they're not just transvestites. So they're not just dressing and behaving like women, but they actually have a gender reassignment, sexual organ gender reassignment. And he doesn't say exactly how that's happening, but he does mention that it is happening. And so this transgendered initiation then allows for men to become the in-betweens, the go-betweens, to go between men's quarters and women's quarters, and then to act as the mediators between the genders of these societies. And so they were really playing a central role here in all aspects of community building. So he says this is kind of his way of kind of creating a logic about why men became like women. Why did they be? Because what's happening in Che and Yi's contemporary period is that they're seeing a lot of very effeminate men acting as attendants to shamans, female shamans in Korea. And so what's kind of going unsaid, I think Inu talks about this more explicitly, is this question of why is it that there are these homosexual men in the shaman circuit. And so he's trying to really reason that out. Che is actually kind of rationalizing that out in this kind of, in this shamanic history between Siberia and Korea.
So let's talk about Yinhua then, the other side and the other person that we mentioned at the start of this, and how he begins to see this. Of course, he has the same idea of masculizing, of making a more masculine Korean identity, a Korean history, and he goes all the way back to Tangun, of course, which is the mythical progenitor of the Korean race and the Korean people. But he walks through this and he finds evidence, and you write here, and this is his quote, of attractive sons among noble people were selected and dolled up with cosmetics and adornments, and they were called flower boys. And this is, but beyond this, it also connects shamans to the state itself, because he recognizes that these flower boys were being used in royal court to conduct things like rain prayers. So it really binds the shamans together with the Korean state at the same time, despite this history as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So Inunhwa is looking at really what's happening in the Korean state specifically, and he's again borrowing from a lot of the Shila research that's emerging at this time. Again, tying in the Tangun ruler and to the Korean state, the kind of primordial Korean state, and kind of exploring this idea of Gojoseon, which is the ancient Joseon mythical kingdom of Korea. And the Hwarang, those are the flower boys. I mean, Hwarang literally is a translation. Flower boys is literally a translation of Hwarang. They were considered the Paksu, and flower boys. They were considered to be the people that were really essential for the establishment of the Shilla dynastic social hierarchy. And it's interesting because in the literature that he's drawing from, which is actually going back to the Chosun period, his archives from the Chosun period, he finds that they made that a clear statement. One of the prerequisites was that the flower boys had to be beautiful, and they had to also be able to be multiply gifted. So they had to be gifted in the martial arts, gifted at also then conducting court rituals. And so the rain prayers, which was perhaps the most important ritual that had happened within the Chosun courts, was something that they actually actively participated in. And then if that's happening during the Chosun period, then what else is happening is that we have the state shamans, also the what they call kukmu, which is the state shamans. They're also then participating in the rain prayers alongside then the Hwarang during the Chosun, or perhaps as far back as the Shilla dynastic period, but they're really Inunghwa is drawing this information from the Chosun records. And so he's saying that they are actually then working in service of the Shilla court.
And from this history, Yi is also making another claim here. He connects in some ways the presence of the flower boys in the Chosun courts to the decline and the eventual collapse of the state itself. He writes that when the state becomes emasculated in this way, it is also the end of it. It's binding its fate in some way. So he seems to be linking the transgender shamanistic phenomena again quite perniciously with the collapse of Korea itself.
Yeah, right. Because the kind of his contemporary comment that he's making is about the Hwarangmyo, which was a kind of a curse word that was used for femi boys, and it was literally comes from, the translation would be the female flower boys. That term was used to describe the attendants. They might have been Buddhist attendants, but the male attendants, I should say cis male attendants, in the shamanic rituals. And says this is where the term comes from. Is from this idea that they were co-opted by shamans and feminized for shamanic work, and then treated as women. They were all seen as one and the same as the female shamans, and that was the sign that the Korean nation was in strife, was due to collapse, and that. If he's making that kind of argument, basically what he's saying then is that he could tell that the Chosun dynasty was going to collapse from the mid-Chosun period onward. And what's happening there is actually this kind of, one, there's blaming China. Something goes wrong in Korea, you blame China. So that's one thing that's happening. And so he's basically also pointing to this idea that shamanism in Korea is very similar to shamanism in China, and actually a lot of shamanic practices that were happening in Korea came from China. And the other thing he's saying is that because Korea was very kind of Middle Kingdom oriented from the late Chosun period onward, that was the reason for Korea's demise. That argument was made by many colonial scholars, that, when people are saying, how do we get here? A lot of people were just making that argument that it was because of the Chineseness of Korea's governing system that Korea fell into its demise.
And one of the things that comes through here, it seems as though through all the concern and all that deep concern that they seem to have here, one of the real concerns they have is almost a gossipy concern. There's some quotes here, and there's stuff about these stories of a young man who doesn't have a beard walking and sitting amongst the female shamans and seizing the opportunity to trick someone's daughter and all these sorts of things. Of course, the next sentence after he tricks his daughter is, however, the evidence is kept secret and difficult to expose, which of course is quite telling, I suppose. But it does have this gossipy idea that of almost jealous men, of the idea that they're looking at other men who can perhaps pass through, even if it's not real, pass into and sit with the women and engage in their world in a way that they can't. And they sit on the outside and they're bitter and enraged by it.
So, an interesting thing about some of those records, and again, this is coming from the 16th century records that a Cholo provincial magistrate had written, that Hwa finds. And so he uses this kind of evidence to talk about what's happening in the Shilla period, which is not the best kind of historical research. But anyway, what this exposes really is not so much that, men were just kind of masking themselves as women in order to go and do stuff with women and, have their way with women unencumbered, but rather that men were actually cross-dressing as women and that they were passing as women. And it wasn't just that. They were actually beautiful men, perhaps young adolescent men that were dressing up as women, before they had a beard, which indicates that they were prepubescent. And that this was something that was really a popular thing. Did the shamans want it? Maybe. Did the women that were the clients of these shamans want it? Probably. For whatever reason that was, my thinking is that it was perhaps for the service, for the benefit of the spiritual service. And so there was something where the shamans were interpreting this as the spirit gods, their guardian spirits, their patron spirits, were calling and asking, requesting, demanding for these boyish women to enter into the ritual. And that was somehow going to help make the ritual more efficacious. So that was happening on the ground. Based on these records, that's what it tells me, is that cross-dressing was actually occurring through the Chosun period. And, and that was homosocially a kind of a normative thing. And while people were saying that it was bad, it was happening, and it was perhaps happening more frequently than it was reported.
So let's move on to the last section of your paper here, of your chapter, and with an interesting thought that you enter into the record here, and it's really quite interesting. And that is, you have another idea for perhaps why shamanism was used for colonial purposes and nationalistic purposes, and that is the idea of colonial drag. So I might get you to introduce that, and then we can build the story up a little bit here, because it's really quite an interesting thought. And we have touched, or at least hinted towards it a little bit through some of what we've spoken about so far.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. Colonial drag is really what I see happening with the Sungshin and Johap. So going back to the original question, the reason that I think the Sungshin and Johap deserve so much attention is because this is one of the very few cases in the colonial period where you actually see the agency of shamans during this time, where everywhere else you only see people who are not shamans, who are not part of the community, lambasting shamans. Here you see shamans sometimes actually even being accepted and supported and encouraged by the newspapers, and other times acting without any regard of what the newspaper missions, the journalist missions were. And so that independence and that agency is something I really appreciate in the Sungshin and Johap. One of the things that the biggest accusations that was being made against the Sungshin and Johap when they were participating as Shinto devotees in Shinto shrine was that they were faking it, that these were not real Shinto devotees. They were just doing it in order to be rebel rousers, and that they were faking being Japanese, faking their love and devotion to the Japanese deities, particularly Amaterasu, Omikami, and the Emperor Meiji, that those two deities were not being properly venerated because shamans were not actually really honoring them. And they were just doing it in order to get in good with the Japanese imperial monarchy. And that argument that they were faking it then tells me that they were perhaps actually entering into this kind of performance. But there was some kind of performative aspect to it. Whether or not they're faking it, who knows? We can't really talk with any kind of assurance about motive and feelings. But there is that possibility that they were acting, pretending, faking their devotion, or that they might have been doing it sincerely, but as a way to do something else. That was a performance of sorts. And so the idea of performativity of a shamanic ritual is something that a lot of anthropologists today use, that kind of verbiage they use today. But I think that performativity of the Sungshin Choa existed during the colonial period. And it was really a way to really kind of create a kind of dragging of the colonizer, to make sure that you understood how power works and how patriarchy works, how foreign rule works. So all of these things that these female shamans probably could not do in their own bodies, they would do them through the performance. They would act it out. And that was kind of a strategy of survival, to create this cultural sphere that then allowed their bodies some visibility when they were otherwise in the newspapers and in the intellectual circuit being denied and erased. And so it's kind of a survival mechanism. And so in all of those ways, if we think about the queer culture of dragging, borrowing from Judith Butler's argument about how drag subverts the distinction between the inner and outer psychic space, I see the Sungshin Shinto patronage and experimentation of Shinto as a kind of dragging of the state, a dragging of patriarchy, a dragging of state-based rituals in order for their own culture to survive.
So that dragon, and it's quite an interesting thought, it also comes about with a change. I mean, I suppose we touched on this earlier, but a change in the way that shamanism is practiced also, because suddenly this becomes public. Instead of these private rituals inside people's houses, it's suddenly these huge public spectacles and public events and these public plays in some ways. And you're right here, they're incredibly loud. There's lots of laughter, lots of noise. And the Korean elites are incredibly dismayed by this, incredibly taken aback. And yet they can't do too much about it because it is incredibly popular in the 1920s. And of course, this guild is also doing more than just that. They're reaching out and they're doing public works. You write about a particular instance when Seoul was hit by flooding and natural disasters, and the guild comes together and fundraisers. So I might open up that aspect as they're dragging and they're doing these the exuberant displays and dragging the colonial government and the colonizers all together. It also is a shift in the way that the shamans are being seen. And because it's so public and so out there and so engaged with the people, it is not something that's easily suppressed either at the same time. Yeah.
They were incredibly public. And so, we're previous to this, or maybe even outside of those. So it's not like the Sungshin Choa captured all shamans. I'm sure. I know that there were shamans practicing that were not a part of this organization. And those people were lambasted in the same ways, for creating rituals in the neighborhoods or, in the private gardens of people's homes, and for the privacy of the private acts that they committed. Whereas Sungshin Choa was very, very public. It was out on public squares, public theaters, and they created public offices and all of those things. And so they were, that was very, very different for this time period. And then they also acted as a philanthropy organization during those times of natural disasters. So they raised money for their guild. They created clothing donations, food donations, relief efforts, and construction relief efforts, etc. And they participated in all of those things. And so they were seen in some ways to be a very vital and useful kind of civic organization. But those rituals that they put on, they were not really rituals in the way that we think of shamanic ritual of muhu. They were rather more like performances. So they put on things like celebrations of important birthdays and certain anniversaries and honoring sacred holidays, etc. And then they also did this thing where they participated in avant-garde theater. So they were participating in performances, in theater, in poetry, in dance classes, all of these things that were very much kind of popular avant-garde movement that you'd find maybe anywhere in the world. And that was very enticing for a lot of the people that participated in this. But on top of it, they were also very, kind of cutting edge, I would say, tongue-in-cheek. They covered topics that were very risque, and in some people's minds, very uncouth. So there's some sexual content, some very licentious content that was permitted because of the popularity. And so, this is a kind of public artistic expression that some of these intellectuals had never seen up to this time.
And just to, I suppose, the next question, they seem to be walking an incredibly fine line. I mean, of course, as we said, because of the publicity of what they're doing and the popularity of what they're doing, they do survive and they do maintain quite well. But I suppose we touched on a lot in the last podcast, the idea that this is also a time when the colonial government has this women's problem in their mind. They're trying to is it almost like a negative eugenics, an idea that they want women to create a stronger colonial people in a sense. And so they're trying to educate women, but educate women down a certain pathway. And yet at the same time, these transgendered shamanistic plays, you're right, they seem to be pushing the envelope in incredible ways here. The idea is that you have women out there donning hats and having sword fights and doing things that are traditionally things that are part of Korean masculinity. And at the same time, the male people inside these plays are characterized as binary and effeminate and impotent and all these kind of things. It's a real feminist liberation kind of message at the same time when the colonial government is desperately trying to do the opposite in some ways and to bind women through some education, but bind them into a different parcel altogether.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I'd mentioned that the Sujining Jo-up organization, we see traces of it from the Chosun period into the colonial period. But what's really kind of a tragedy is that the Sujining Jo-up, they fall into disarray and they basically disappear during the colonial period. As far as I know, unless somebody has done research to find otherwise, as far as I know, I don't think they did not survive after the colonial period. And part of the reason might have been just that this was one of the campaigns that the colonial government saw as counterproductive to the eugenics movement, counterproductive to the kind of the war mobilization period. And they shut it down. Unfortunately, that you don't really see any more activity among the Sujining Jo-up after this time period, and that's really it is a shame. But I think that you're right. They kind of were, although the eugenics movement really starts in the 1930s, and so they did both exist at the same time. I don't think that they were able to be. There was no way for them to be copacetic throughout the colonial period.
So as a final couple of questions here, I might take questions directly from your research that you pose to the reader, and then you go ahead and answer yourself. The first one, of course, is this. When negative depictions of the shamans in the colonial media proliferated, why didn't the shamans write in their own defense?
Yeah, that is the funny thing. I mean, it's not that they weren't literate or that they weren't reading. In fact, I recently have come across a number of different publications that on my last visit to Korea that demonstrated that shamans were very good about keeping records of their rituals in paper form. And so there are some records of private records that shamans had of their practices. And so there's kind of autoethnographies in certain ways that I did not know about before. But for the most part, in the public eye, the ritualists just did not self-represent in publication. And, I guess one of the things I say here is, as a kind of really frustrated historian on that front, is that they were kind of enacting their everyday struggles of resistance for the record through their actions. And that it was kind of a strategy that they used to kind of privilege their performance over the script. And I use the words of the late Jose Esteban Munoz and his Disidentifications, Queers of Color and the Performance of Politics book that was so important to me, where he says that, in privileging performance, that people, queers, were able to create a world-making power of disidentification. And that might have been it. That if you don't write it down for people to pick apart, if you perform it, and you perform it right, you can create this power of disidentifying what people might call you, of disidentifying how you're going to be labeled. And that might then kind of shift somehow the power imbalance in a different direction. And so that, maybe that was it. The kind of the suspicion of the pen or the brush might have been something that shamans were very well aware of, and they had a reason to be, because all the literature that existed up to this time, none of it served in their purposes, none of it served in their interests, and so why would they participate in that? Yeah.
So as a final question here, I might do a bit of a summation of your thesis here. And I'll run a quote here, and perhaps we can build it up, and I'll let you finish on what this particular chapter and your summation of the chapter itself. But you're right. I would call ritual specialists and cultural nationalists asynchrony with modernity or refusal for progressive history as a queer phenomena. And of course, that is what runs through this chapter of yours, this idea that you are viewing, and of course, this is a incredibly real and graphic and well-researched way to actually see it. You're seeing this broad phenomena that we've been speaking about throughout this podcast as a queer phenomenon.
Yeah. And I'm using the word queer in the original sense and also in the contemporary sense. The original meaning different or odd, and then the contemporary sense as in non-heteronormative. So in both of those ways, I see it. That ritual specialists and cultural nationalists, particularly Inahua Cheonsan, they were writing against modernity in a way. And they were writing in this kind of very queer way at a queer time.
So on that final thought there, that's a good place to leave this. Of course, I'm going to link the chapter and the book in which today's podcast has been which I did my research on, and of course, which Merose has written and researched herself. I'm going to link it below, and I do encourage people to go and read it for themselves. And of course, if you want any pre-content for this podcast, I will also link the previous podcast that I did with Merose on a very similar topic about Korean shamans in the colonial period. So on that, Merose Hwang, thanks for coming on the Korean Hour podcast.
Thank you so much for having me back. It was great.